So let's get into a bit of a legal mystery. A really fascinating story about rights, money, and what happens when the doors to the courthouse seem to just slam shut. And it all kicks off with one single, pretty astonishing number.
70%. Just let that sink in for a second. 70%. I mean, can you imagine if 70% of something really important just vanished overnight? Well, in this case, we're talking about people's ability to get justice.
So, that 70%, that was the huge, immediate, and lasting drop in the number of people taking their employers to court after 2013. You see, before then, it was free to bring a claim. But then, the government introduced fees, and suddenly, it could cost you more than £1,000 just to get your case heard.
And that really is the big question here, isn't it? The question that went all the way to the UK's Supreme Court. Were these fees just a fair price to pay for using a public service, or were they something else entirely? Were they a barrier so high that it was basically putting justice up for sale?
To figure this out, you got to look at the official story first. I mean, why did the government bring in these fees to begin with? Well, they had a pretty clear three-part reason. On the surface, the government's thinking seemed pretty logical. First off, shift the cost from the general taxpayer to the people who are actually using the courts. Makes sense. Second, they thought the fees would push people to settle their arguments sooner, before it got to a tribunal. And third, they wanted to weed out the really weak or totally frivolous cases that were just clogging up the system. It sounds reasonable enough, right? But let's see what the evidence actually showed. See, the Supreme Court wasn't just interested in the theory. They wanted to know what actually happened in the real world. And when they started digging into the facts, the government's whole argument began to fall apart, piece by piece. First up, that big goal of covering costs. It was a spectacular failure. They were hoping the fees would bring in enough money to cover about a third of the tribunal's running costs. But in reality, they barely scraped together 13%. And why the huge gap? Well, because so few people were bringing claims anymore, the income just dried up. The fees were so high they basically scared away their customers.
Okay, so what about weeding out those weak cases? You'd think that would have worked, right? Nope. The evidence showed the exact opposite happened. After the fees came in, the percentage of claims that actually failed in court went up. That kind of suggests the fees weren't just scaring off people with weak cases, they were scaring off people with strong ones too.
And you know, this is where the story really pivots from just numbers and policy to the real-world human cost. The court looked past the spreadsheets to understand the impossible choices regular people were being forced to make.
To really get it, the court looked at some very realistic scenarios. So, picture this. A single monitor working full-time on a pretty modest salary, and she believes she was just fired unfairly.
And this is where it gets really stark. The court used some solid research to figure out the bare minimum income needed for a decent standard of living. For this woman, her actual take-home pay was already over £200 below that line every single month. Now, on top of that, where's she supposed to find an extra £1,200 for the tribunal fee? It's an impossible choice. She wouldn't be cutting back on luxuries. She'd be sacrificing basic, reasonable necessities for her and her kid.
But it wasn't just about whether you could physically find the money. For a whole lot of cases, the fees created another huge problem. They made going to court completely illogical from a financial standpoint.
Just think about this. The typical payout for a successful claim about unpaid wages was about £900, but the fee just to start the case was £1,200. You were guaranteed to lose money even if you won. It's madness. Or how about this? You'd have to pay a £390 fee to chase after an average award of £500. When you factor in the stress, the time, and the fact you might not win, it just becomes a completely irrational thing to do. So, with all this evidence piling up, the court went back to basics. They looked at a legal principle that's not just policy, it is literally woven into the fabric of the UK's entire legal system.
They talked about the rule of law, and a core part of that is access to justice. It's not some optional extra you pay for, like a service. It's the whole mechanism that makes sure the laws passed by Parliament are real, that they actually apply to everyone. Without it, our rights are just words on a page.
And believe me, this isn't some new idea. The court traces this principle all the way back 800 years to the Magna Carta from 1215. For centuries, this promise has been at the very heart of the law. You cannot sell justice and you cannot deny it.
And Lord Reed, in this very case, brought that ancient principle right up to the present day. He basically said, look, if people can't get into a courtroom to enforce their rights, then all those laws that Parliament creates to protect them, they're worthless. They become a dead letter.
Okay, so you've got the damning evidence on one side and this ancient fundamental legal principle on the other. The stage was set for the Supreme Court's final verdict.
The court's reasoning was devastatingly simple, really. It all boiled down to two things. First, the fees were unlawful because they were just plain unaffordable for so many people. They created that impossible choice between justice and basic living standards. And second, they were unlawful because they were irrational. They made it pointless to even try to claim what you were rightfully owed in many cases.
And so the hammer came down. The entire fee system was declared unlawful. And not just from that day forward, no. It was unlawful from the very moment it was created. It had to be wiped off the books, immediately.
So, a huge victory, right? The fees were gone. But the story doesn't quite end there. The court's judgment also pointed out another pretty big problem with the system, and it leaves all of us with a really tough question that still hasn't gone away.
On top of everything else, the court found the fee structure was indirectly discriminatory. You see, there were two tiers of fees. The more complex Type B claims, which include things like discrimination cases, had much higher fees. And the evidence showed that a greater proportion of women bring these types of claims. So the system put women at a particular disadvantage, and the government just couldn't provide a good enough reason for doing it.
And that's where we land. The fees were thrown out and access to tribunals was restored. But the core dilemma is still there. Courts and tribunals cost a lot of money to run. So this whole case leaves us with a profound and difficult question. How do we as a society properly fund our justice system while still holding true to that 800-year-old promise that justice will never, ever be for sale?